Well, now let's get talking as Nigerians continue to battle with the emergence of fuel scarcity. The Federal Competition and Consumer Protection Commission says it will continue and ensure that filling stations sell petroleum products in compliance with the law to prevent hardship on the citizens. The Commission says it is in engagement with state consumer protection agencies and other relevant stakeholders in all of the petroleum marketing business to discuss issues that could help cushion the impact of this scarcity. But let's understand more on the roles of the protection agency. And I'm being joined live from our Abuja studios by the Executive Vice Chairman and the Chief Executive Officer of the Federal Competition and Consumer Protection Commission, Mr. Babatunde Irukera. Mr. Irukera, good afternoon, and thank you so much for joining us on the program. Role of consumer protection seems to be key here. But first, let me ask that many will say it's when a product is not available, that is when people try to herd. So what really have you seen following this pronouncement? Before we now talk about what you do to help us manage and make sure that we are not exploited.
Thank you for the question. Our initial assessment and the information we've gathered leads us to a pretty firm conclusion that there are no constrictions with respect to the supply chain. The major marketers, although identify the fact that their tanks are not full, but they say that there is sufficient product. The downstream regulator has also said that they're pretty certain that there's sufficient product. NNPCL has also said that. And there is nothing that has really changed other than the fact that people are reacting to a statement by the president. And the nature of our work, both in regulating competition and regulating consumer protection, is that it is a violation of law to manipulate supply for the purpose of enhancing price. And so there is only one conclusion we can come to. It is either that there is a manipulation to enhance price, or in the alternative, or maybe a combination of that, there is a level of apprehension amongst consumers that is making them buy in excess of what their regular consumption patterns are. We've issued a statement to address both, and that is to assure consumers that there is sufficient supply, and at the same time to let businesses, marketers and retailers know that any form of limiting supply, storage, dispensing, distribution, or retailing in any way, shape, or form is a violation of the Federal Competition and Consumer Protection Act, whether from a consumer protection standpoint or from a competition regulation standpoint. One of the things I'd like to say is that I think the government has acted very swiftly, NNPCL has intervened, and they've provided some level of clarity. As a matter of fact, the feedback we're getting from our surveillance efforts today is that while there's still excessive lines at filling stations, it's not escalating at the rate it started out in the first place.
Some would ask that what is the strength with regards to maybe staff with FCCPC, talking about 36 states and all of the nooks and crannies. How are you making sure that you get the factuals, talking about the nooks and crannies of the country, getting information from there?
Partnerships. For instance, the Downstream Regulatory Authority also has assets on ground across the country, and so we're collaborating with them. And for instance, we've been in very constant communication with operatives in Lagos of the Lagos Consumer Protection Agency, LASCOPA. As a matter of fact, we have a joint task force that is monitoring in Lagos now. Our team are out in Abuja, and we're working with the Downstream Authority with their assets on ground in other parts of the country.
So level of consumption is also something that many have argued. I don't know if this is within or around the conversations you are having around measuring or confirming the actual level of consumption. This has been an issue for long. I know the Petroleum Ministry and data management is involved in this. But with what you've seen in the field, can you say anything around this, Mr. Irukera?
Well, because our role is materially different from someone who monitors volume both from a value chain standpoint and from a use standpoint. Our relationship with volume is just availability. And what we've seen is, and the point we've made to consumers, is that petroleum products are flammable. And as such, the use, and globally, that's why you don't have people having homes where they have large storage tanks. They purchase as they consume because of the strict controlled storage, dispensation, and even consumption processes and mechanisms. And for instance, there's no other way to consume fuel other than to put it in the devices or the equipment that use fuel. And so what we've said to consumers is, do not change your purchase patterns, let it continue to be consistent with the traditionally accepted consumption mechanisms, and so that you don't have people who are buying more than they need. Because if they start buying more than, if there's a run on supply, it also distorts the market in the sense that more than the anticipated supply in the market is being purchased, even though not necessarily being consumed. And we've also said to the businesses that to the extent that consumption remains normal, there's absolutely no reason why supply should become constricted. And so while we do not have visibility into consumption patterns, we certainly have a responsibility with respect to how purchases are done.
Great stuff. Another thing that Nigerians have always talked about, especially when it has to do with fuel, is that when there is any form of increment, many believe that some fuel stations still have in stock, but immediately it's quick for them to change the price to maybe to a higher price if instituted by government. But if another law comes and says you need to go back, then there's always the issue of we can't get our engineers to come fix the meters. We can't get our technical guys to come work on all of this. What are you also doing around that? Because I think that is around consumer protection too.
Well, I mean, if there's a sticker price for a product and or a pump price, as in the case with fuel, and that price is something that is otherwise properly determined by other regulatory instruments, which is the case in petroleum products, or at least with respect to premium motor spirits, then we would respect that, and we would expect all retailers to sell within the acceptable parameters. Anything outside of that is a violation of law, because the law prohibits selling or supplying products at unreasonable, exploitative, manifestly unjust, or unfair prices. And typically price is a determination that is negotiated between a seller and a buyer in the market. But in a regulated industry where there is an accepted and transparent regulatory platform for determining price, as is the case with PMS, selling in excess of that regulatorily determined price is excessive pricing. And so marketers also have a responsibility to be nimble and versatile enough to be responsive to whatever the regulatory pricing is very quickly. And so if there's a regulatory price that is determined by the appropriate authority, marketers owe an obligation to immediately change, whether it's their displays or their dispensation mechanisms. They owe that responsibility to that very quickly. And when that doesn't happen, it's a violation, and we hold them accountable to the law.
Interesting stuff. Now, before I take you away from this topic and talk about one or two other things before I let you go, Mr. Rukera, what is your advice, maybe number one, to Nigerians at this time who are panic buying, of course, and of course, your message to the likes of the Ipmans of this world, independent petroleum marketers, major petroleum marketers who have these products? What would you be telling them at this time?
I suppose for the consumers, I would say that I can understand the philosophy behind wanting to accumulate for storage and to save money for when prices change. But this is very dangerous with respect to this particular product, and the potential for loss is far in excess of whatever savings, both from inconvenience and fiscal standpoint. And so I'd say that consumers should trust the government on this. The government is engaged, and we from the FCCPC are quite satisfied with the nature and how robust the engagements are. And so I'd say consumers should trust the government and continue to purchase products based on their regular or traditional consumption patterns. With respect to businesses, the Constitution provides that the government would work to ensure that there's shared prosperity and ensure that the means of production and wealth is not concentrated in the hands of a few. And that is where the establishment of the Federal Competition and Consumer Protection Commission derives its legitimacy from, and we owe that obligation to ensure that anybody who engages in that kind of conduct that sabotages the government or the economy essentially and distorts markets and makes life difficult for consumers will be held accountable. We might not have the capacity or the tools to go across the country to hold everybody accountable, but we'll make scapegoats of those who we find, especially those who we expect to be exemplary in their conduct. And we said yes in our statement that we released that in the spectrum of penalties, whoever is found wanting from an evidence-based investigation or assessment, we would stay at the very highest spectrum of the penalty in holding them accountable.
Brilliant stuff. As usual. And other things that we got messages, ahead of this show when we tweeted that you're going to be around. People still talked about the loan shark thing and those that have been adopted in. Is there any update with regards to that? What is FCCPC doing at the moment with regards to that? What's the update with regards to digital banking? We saw what happened during COVID and all of that, that shift to the digital space. What more are you doing?
Thank you. So there's quite some internal regulatory work going on within the FCCPC and among the members of the Joint Regulatory and Enforcement Task Force that includes financial regulators, the telecom regulator, and law enforcement to proceed from the limited and interim regulatory framework to a more standing regulatory framework. However, one thing is very clear. The preponderance or the urgency or emergency of how pervasive the abuse was has significantly reduced. We're still seeing isolated cases of abuse, and we're getting involved and addressing that. Most of the abuse that we're seeing are small players, because all the players that need to be on Play Store hardly engaging in any abusive conduct, because we know where they are. They've committed not to doing that. That they won't do that has become a requirement by Google for them to be on Play Store, and the consequences for abuse is very stiff, including losing the privilege of being able to gain customers. And so in those smaller ones, it's a lot more work to track them. Some of them are operating through Facebook, some of them independently on the internet, but we're hunting them wherever we find them, and the feedback we get from consumers continues to be helpful. And so it's fair to say that the big problem of defaming consumers and harassing them in recovering balances, the big problem is behind us. But the isolated situations continue to confront us, and we continue to work at addressing that as we go.
And a lot really needs to be done, because looking at that sector in the next few years, basically it will take charge of almost the financial space, as everyone has to adopt digital technology at this time. So for those that didn't meet up the other time, do they still have the opportunity? That's for those digital lending companies that couldn't, or outfits that couldn't meet up at that time. Do they still have any opportunity at the moment, Mr. Rukera?
So that's a good question. We provided repeated extensions until we finally closed the registration window. And it was the right thing to do. I mean, we had given sufficient notice to everyone that was in the business. And one of the things we did was to make sure that even though this was a very costly, extremely expensive process and a very resource-intensive process, but to just show our fidelity and to provide stability, we made sure that we did this gratis. Typically, there's no reason to do things for business for gratis when they're going to make money from it. But we did it gratis. But there are ongoing discussions about reopening the window for primarily those whose businesses did not exist at that time. The window is not closed to them. So for people who are just coming into that business and are legitimate and are complying with the regulatory framework, oh yes, we'll continue to provide support and registration that allows their business to proceed. But for those who were already in Google Play Store, those who had every opportunity because of how long their business had been in operation and did not take advantage of the period and the additional extensions, essentially they were not diligent in pursuing their registration. We have no sympathies for them. And if we would reopen the window for them, it would be at significant cost.
Finally, I know the FCCPC has been so busy, and I'd like to end with the level of complaints. I think Nigerians are more aware of the protection of their rights at this time. Tell us about that. What are you getting? How are Nigerians getting across to FCCPC for complaints?
And so it's quite a paradox because we're receiving more and more complaints. We're receiving far more complaints than we've ever received. And the reason why I call it a paradox is that it's a measure of, or at least it's an indication of dissatisfaction, but it's also an indication of how robust the consumer protection reform in the country has been, in the sense that people now feel more discriminatory and feel more entitled, as they should, to certain levels of treatment by those who provide services and goods to them. And so they're complaining more. And it also demonstrates that there is now a platform that is dependable and reliable that they can complain to. Ultimately, the ideal and optimized complaint resolution framework is for companies to resolve complaints. It is an aberration for the government to be the one resolving complaints. Essentially, you're making the FCCPC an outsourced multi-company customer service desk. And we're working with companies to arrive at that point where they have their own standalone complaint resolution platforms, and the government becomes only a secondary complaint resolution platform. And when that happens, we would make companies pay for that service.
Well, it's a good way to leave it. Interesting conversation with Mr. Babatunde Rukere as usual. He's the Executive Vice Chairman and CEO of the Federal Competition and Consumer Protection Commission, FCCPC. Do enjoy the rest of your day, and we expect to get fuel, at least at the approved price at our filling stations. Thank you so much.